History remembers the winners, but almost nobody remembers the weapon that nearly changed everything. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was dying. Berlin burned under artillery fire. American bombers crossed German skies almost untouched. Soviet armies were closing in from the east like an iron trap. Cities had become ruins. Railways were broken. Fuel was nearly gone. Factories that once produced steel, tanks, and aircraft by the thousands were reduced to smoke and concrete. To the world, Nazi Germany looked finished, but hidden beneath forests, buried inside mountains, and concealed inside giant concrete pens along the North Sea coast. German engineers were preparing a weapon that frightened Allied naval intelligence more than almost anything else created during the war. It was not the V-1 flying bomb. It was not the V-2 rocket. It was something quieter, something colder, something that moved beneath black water. A submarine so advanced that some historians would later call it the first true modern submarine. The Type XXI U-boat. And for a few terrifying months, American and British planners feared a nightmare. What if it arrived too early? What if hundreds of them had entered the Atlantic in 1944? What if Germany had found a way to choke Britain again, and maybe even strike the American coast with a new kind of invisible war? That possibility, more than many plurialis, was real. To understand why, you have to go back to the beginning. In 1939, when World War II erupted in Europe, the German Navy was not ready for a long war against Britain. Admiral Karl Dönitz knew it. He had studied naval warfare obsessively. He understood something many politicians did not: brighten lives by the sea, food, oil, steel, troops, ammunition, everything that kept Britain alive crossed the Atlantic. If Germany could sink enough merchant ships, Britain could starve. It almost worked. During the early years of the war, German U-boats became the terror of the Atlantic. They hunted in wolf packs, surfacing at night, moving faster on the surface than submerged, slipping between merchant vessels and firing torpedoes at close range. The ocean became a graveyard. Freighters vanished into darkness. Lifeboats drifted for days in freezing water. Men burned alive on oil-covered seas. American newspapers later printed photographs of merchant ships exploding just miles from the eastern coast of the United States. Civilians on beaches could sometimes see flames on the horizon. That was how close the war came. By 1942, German submarines were sinking Allied shipping at an alarming rate. There were months when losses became so severe that British officials privately feared catastrophe. But then something changed. Technology. The Allies adapted. Radar improved. Escort carriers appeared. Long-range patrol aircraft closed the Atlantic gap. New sonar systems made hiding harder. Intelligence breakthroughs, especially the gradual cracking of German naval codes, allowed Allied convoys to avoid submarine concentrations. Suddenly, the hunters became hunted. By 1943, the Atlantic had turned against Germany. U-boats that once stalked prey were now being slaughtered. Crews called it Black May. Month after month, submarines failed to return. Young German sailors boarded U-boats knowing many of them would die before ever seeing land again. Dönitz understood the truth with brutal clarity. The old submarines were obsolete. The famous Type V-boats, the workhorses of the U-boat war, had become death traps. They had been designed for another era. Technically, they were not truly underwater vessels at all. They were surface ships that could briefly submerge. That distinction mattered. Traditional submarines spent most of their time on the surface because batteries underwater drained quickly. When submerged, they were slow, blind, and limited. The Allies had learned this weakness. Aircraft could spot them. Radar could track them. And once forced underwater, most U-boats became vulnerable prey. Germany needed something radically different. Not an improved submarine, a revolution. That revolution began in secret design offices. German engineers imagined a vessel built not to travel on the surface, but to live underwater. Its hull was streamlined for submerged speed. Its batteries were massively enlarged. Its electric motors were far more powerful. Its systems were automated. Its sonar was better. Its torpedo handling was faster. And perhaps most Frightening of Allah could stay submerged for far longer than any submarine before it. The result was astonishing. The Type 21 could reach around 17 knots underwater faster submerged than many Allied escorts could manage while hunting. That changed everything. Imagine an Allied destroyer dropping depth charges on a submarine below. Normally, the submarine tried to hide. Now, for the first time, the submarine could sometimes outrun the attacker. That was revolutionary. Even more alarming was the snorkel. The snorkel allowed diesel engines to run while submerged at periscope depth, drawing air from above the waterline. This meant batteries could recharge without fully surfacing. For Allied air patrols, that was terrifying news. A submarine that rarely surfaced was a submarine much harder to kill. In theory, the Type 21 could cross large stretches of the Atlantic while exposing almost nothing above water. It was not perfect. No wartime weapon ever is, but its implications were enormous. American naval intelligence noticed. British planners noticed. And in Washington, men who understood shipping, convoy routes, and Atlantic logistics began asking the same question: how many of these things can Germany build? The answer was frightening, potentially a lot. The German solution was industrial. Instead of building submarines in one shipyard from start to finish, sections would be manufactured inland in factories safe from bombing, then transported by rail or barge to assembly yards. It was a primitive form of modular industrial warfare, a submarine built like an assembly line product. In theory, Germany could mass-produce them. And if Germany mass-produced them, the Battle of the Atlantic might begin all over again. Only this time, the Allies would face submarines far deadlier than anything they had fought before. There was just one problem. The war was already collapsing around Germany. Factories were bombed, transportation lines were shattered, skilled workers were scarce, slave labor used in many underground facilities was brutalized, starved, and often unable to maintain the precision such advanced engineering required. Sabotage became common. Components arrived late, electrical systems failed, whole sections sometimes did not fit properly. On paper, the Type 21 looked like a machine from the future. In reality, Germany was trying to build the future while the present was falling apart. And yet, even with all those problems, the weapon came dangerously close to entering the war in meaningful numbers. That is the part most people do not know. By early 1945, several Type 21 boats were undergoing sea trials. German crews were astonished. Veterans who had served on older U-boats immediately felt the difference. The new submarine was quieter, faster underwater, more comfortable. Relatively speaking, more lethal. Asterisk, for the first time in years, some German submariners believed they might survive combat. One officer later described the sensation as Alice like stepping out of one century and into another. But history was racing faster than engineering. In January 1945, Soviet armies smashed through eastern Germany. In February, Allied bombers devastated transportation networks. In March, American forces crossed the Rhine. In April, Berlin was encircled, and inside hidden submarine pens. Officers prepared for patrols that increasingly felt like missions from a dying world. One of the most remarkable moments came with U-511. Its commander, Adalbert Schnee, was one of Germany's experienced U-boat officers. In late April 1945, as Hitler's empire was collapsing, U-511 finally sailed. The war above the water was nearly over, but below the surface, something extraordinary happened. During its patrol, U-511 reportedly penetrated the screen of British naval forces undetected. According to later accounts, Schnee maneuvered into attack position against a British cruiser. He could have fired. He did not. Because before the attack could be launched, Germany surrendered. Whether every detail of that encounter happened exactly as later described remains debated among historians. But the fact that such a patrol was even possible sent a chill through naval analysts after the war, because it suggested the terrifying possibility was real. The submarine had worked, not perfectly, not fully matured, but It worked. Now imagine the nightmare. Allied planners imagined not one Type 21, not 5, but 200. Picture the Atlantic in late 1944. Convoys steaming toward Britain loaded with fuel for bombers, food for civilians, ammunition for armies preparing for day and the push into Germany. Now picture dozens of fast underwater submarines shadowing those convoys, almost invisibly. Aircraft struggle to spot them. Destroyers lose sonar contact. Torpedoes launch from unexpected angles. Ships burn. Convoys scatter. Replacement shipping becomes harder. Supplies slow. Every week matters. Every delay changes something. Could Type 21 submarines alone have won the war for Hitler? Almost certainly not. By 1944, Allied industrial power was overwhelming. American shipyards produced cargo ships faster than Germany could sink them. American factories built aircraft, engines, and escort vessels on a scale the world had never seen. The Soviet Union was crushing Germany on land, and the Western Allies were already preparing to invade occupied Europe. But not winning the war is not the same as not changing history. That is what makes the Type 21 so haunting. It probably could not have saved Nazi Germany, but it might have changed the timetable of the war. And in war, time is often everything. A delayed invasion, a prolonged Atlantic campaign, higher Allied losses. Political pressure in Britain, a different post-war balance, perhaps not victory, but a different road to defeat. American naval officers understood this clearly after the war. When Allied forces captured German submarine yards, engineers swarmed over the wreckage. They studied hulls. Electrical systems, battery layouts. HYDRODYNAMICS. Torpedo loading mechanisms. What they found stunned them. This was not merely an advanced German submarine. It was the blueprint of the future. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union all absorbed its lessons. Post-war submarines across the world would carry their DNA. Strangely, the weapon that arrived too late for Hitler helped shape the Cold War. American submarines evolved. Soviet submarine programs accelerated. The underwater arms race of the nuclear age. Silent hunters prowling oceans with missiles capable of ending civilization owed something to those desperate German engineers racing against collapse in 1945. That is the irony history rarely pauses to notice. A weapon born in a dictatorship, assembled amid slave labor and ruin, became the ancestor of modern submarine warfare. But the most astonishing part is how close it came. Not close to winning, close to mattering. And sometimes that is even more unsettling, because history often looks inevitable after the fact. We tell ourselves the Allies were destined to win, that Nazi defeat was obvious, that technological desperation at the end of the war was meaningless. But the men studying convoy routes in Washington did not think history felt inevitable. The admirals in London did not think so. The merchant sailors crossing Black Atlantic waters certainly did not think so. They knew something many later generations forget. History is fragile while it is happening. A few months earlier, a few factories were not bombed, a few design problems solved, a few hundred more trained crews. And the Atlantic might have become terrifying again. That is why the Type 21 remains one of the great what-if weapons of World War II. Not because it could have conquered the world, but because it almost arrived in time to make the world pay a much higher price. And somewhere in that cold Atlantic darkness lies the image that haunted Allied planners, a convoyism. Oving west, moonless sky. No radar contact. No aircraft sighting. No warning. And deep below, a machine from the future silently turns into attack position. The first hints did not come from a dramatic battle. They came from fragments, aerial photographs, interrogation reports, rail traffic patterns, factory manifests that did not make sense. By late 1943, Allied intelligence officers in London and Washington had begun to notice something strange. German submarine production had not stopped. In fact, despite relentless bombing, certain sectors of the German war industry appeared to be shifting rather than collapsing. The old way of building submarines slowly, Piece by piece, inside exposed shipyards had become too dangerous. Allied bombers had turned places like Hamburg and Bremen into killing grounds for industrial labor, but German planners had adapted. And in that adaptation lay one of the most extraordinary industrial gambles of the war. Instead of building entire submarines in one place, Germany began building them in pieces. Hull sections were fabricated far inland, sometimes in factories that had never built ships before. Locomotive plants, steel workshops, machinery halls, and improvised industrial sites began manufacturing components for a vessel many of the workers had never seen assembled. These sections were then loaded onto barges, rail cars, and heavy transport routes. They moved across a nation under bombardment, through shattered infrastructure, toward giant assembly yards along the coast. In theory, it was brilliant. In practice, it was chaos, but for a while, it worked just well enough to frighten the Allies. One of the key centers of this effort was the great submarine construction network associated with the German Naval High Command and the industrial vision of men under the authority of Albert Speer. Speer understood something fundamental. Germany could no longer outproduce the United States. That was impossible. By 1944, American industry was almost incomprehensibly vast. The United States could launch merchant ships faster than Germany could sink them. American factories poured out tanks, bombers, engines, ammunition, and trucks in quantities that made pre-war military planners seem like amateurs. Speer did not try to match American volume. He tried to survive American bombing. So production went underground. Literally. Across Germany, hidden complexes emerged beneath hillsides, inside tunnels, inside converted mines, beneath reinforced concrete roofs thick enough to survive air attack. Some of these places were engineering miracles. Some were death camps with machine tools. That darker truth sits at the center of the Type 21 story. The weapon was modern. Its birth was medieval. Slave labor built much of it. Prisoners from concentration camps, political prisoners, foreign forced laborers. Starving civilians, thousands of people were driven into underground industrial systems where exhaustion, disease, beatings, and malnutrition killed them in staggering numbers. For them, the Type 21 was not a futuristic weapon. It was a sentence, a section of hull that weighed too much, a battery compartment assembled under dim light, a misaligned steel plate punished as sabotage, a 12-hour shift that became 16, a winter with no heat, a body that did not wake up. And this created a brutal irony. The German regime believed terror could accelerate industrial precision. In reality, terror often destroyed it. Workers made mistakes. Some resisted deliberately. Measurements went wrong. Electrical assemblies failed inspection. Welds cracked. Components arrived damaged. The dream of streamlined mass production kept colliding with the realities of a collapsing dictatorship. But the Allies did not know all that yet. What they knew was simpler. Something new is coming. British intelligence analysts studied shipping routes and reports from resistance networks. American naval officers reviewed submarine losses and new design rumors. Somewhere inside the intelligence machinery, a picture slowly formed. Germany was building a new generation of submarines. And these submarines might be unlike anything previously seen. That possibility mattered deeply because the memory of the Atlantic crisis was still fresh. In the United States, people often remembered World War II through the beaches of Normandy, the island battles of the Pacific, and the final march into Germany. But before all that, there had been a quieter fear. A fear of empty shelves, a fear of sinking tankers, a fear that oceans themselves could become front line for Britain. That fear was existential. For America, it was strategic. Every rifle sent to Europe crossed water. Every Sherman tank shipped overseas crossed water. Every bomber engine, artillery shell, ration crate, and drum of aviation fuel crossed water. The Atlantic was not merely geography. It was the bloodstream of the Allied war effort, and men like Carl Dönitz understood that better than anyone. Dönitz had never really abandoned his core belief. He believed submarines remained Germany's best chance to hurt the Allies. not defeat them completely by 1940, for even he understood the scale of American industrial power but hurt them enough to force delay, disruption, and political strain. The Type 21 was supposed to be the instrument of that final effort, and in German naval circles, it inspired something that had been rare for a long time: hope. Young officers heard stories, older veterans compared specifications. The numbers sounded unreal. Submerged endurance beyond anything they knew, underwater speed that transformed tactical doctrine, rapid torpedo reload capability, streamlined hydrodynamics that made older submarines feel ancient, a new sonar system that promised more effective underwater attack for crews who had watched friends vanish in the Atlantic. This sounded less like a new boat and more like a second chance. But hope is not the same as readiness. When the first Type 21 hulls neared completion, another truth emerged. The boats were too advanced for the Germany that was trying to build them. Submarine construction had always been complex. Precision mattered. Hull tolerances mattered. Electrical reliability mattered. Now Germany was trying to assemble a revolutionary underwater weapon from modules manufactured by scattered facilities under bombing pressure, transport disruption, labor shortages, and political panic. The results were often maddening. Sections arrived misaligned. Pipes did not match. Electrical systems shorted. Valve assemblies failed. Battery installations caused serious problems. Machinery that looked perfect on paper turned unpredictable at sea. The boats were modern. The production environment was collapsing. And yet, even with those flaws, allied concern kept growing. By early 1945, the war above ground had become apocalyptic. Battle of the Bulge had failed to save Germany in the West. The Soviet offensive in the East was crushing entire armies. American bombers dominated. Daylight. British bombers owned much of the night. Rail junctions exploded. Refugees filled roads. Fuel vanished. Cities burned. And in the middle of that ruin, some German naval officers still believed the Type 21 might matter. It was an astonishing act of institutional fate. In one sense, it was irrational. In another, it was understandable. Because war compresses time in strange ways. If a weapon can change the next 3 months, then it can matter even if the next 3 years are impossible. That was the logic. A few dozen operational Type the 21st boats in the Atlantic might not win the war. But what if they could sink enough shipping to slow Allied momentum? What if they could force more escorts into convoy duty? What if they could disrupt invasion logistics? What if they could make the Atlantic dangerous again? That what if haunted Allied planning more than many later generations appreciate. And then came the sea trials. For German submariners, the first submerged runs could feel uncanny. A veteran of older boats understood immediately that this was different. Traditional submarines often felt like vessels temporarily hiding underwater. The Type 21 felt designed for underwater life itself. Its shape made sense. Below the surface, its speed was startling. Its silence was improved. Its tactical possibilities were new. One could almost feel naval warfare shifting, and yet time kept running faster than technology. When the first operational patrols finally approached reality, Germany itself was disintegrating. The Red Army was nearing Berlin. American troops were advancing through Western Germany. The Reich was becoming geography without strategy. And that is where the story becomes almost cinematic. One of the boats that has fascinated historians ever since was U-511. Its commander, Adalbert, was not a reckless novice. He was experienced, respected, and understood both the old Atlantic War and the desperate circumstances of 1945 when U-511 sailed. Hitler's Germany was already effectively dying. The mission itself almost felt like history running out of time. The patrol has since entered naval legend. According to later accounts, U-511 approached British naval forces without detection. It maneuvered into a favorable attack position against a British cruiser. The submarine was where it needed to be. The shot was there, and then it did not fire. Because Germany had surrendered, it is one of the strangest near moments in naval history. a weapon built too late. A perfect attack position reached after the war was already lost. A silent proof of concept. That detail matters enormously, not because one cruiser would have changed the war, but because it suggested something larger. The concept worked, not flawlessly, not at scale, but enough to make post-war admirals pay attention. And after the war ended, they did. When Allied forces captured German shipyards, naval engineers moved fast. The United States Navy studied every detail. So did Britain. So did the Soviet Union. Captured hulls were examined with intense professional fascination. The lines of the hull. The battery capacity. The arrangement of systems. The torpedo handling mechanisms. The hydrodynamic design. The philosophy of underwater warfare embedded in the boat itself. The conclusion was unmistakable. This was not merely a better wartime submarine. This was the beginning of something new. The Americans understood that quickly. So did the Soviets. And here lies another astonishing twist in the story. The weapon that almost changed the end of World War II helped shape the opening decades of the Cold War. Post-war submarine design did not simply borrow from the Type XXI. In many ways, it absorbed its worldview. The future of submarines was not surface cruising with occasional dives. The future was sustained underwater dominance. That logic would eventually lead toward nuclear submarines, machines that could remain submerged for months, carrying weapons powerful enough to destroy cities. In that sense, the Type 21 was a bridge between the Atlantic convoy war and the nuclear oceans of the Cold War, between the diesel era and the atomic age, between old submarine warfare and modern undersea strategy. And that is why the Type 21 remains so haunting. Because unlike many late-war wonder weapons, it was not fantasy. The V weapons terrorized cities. Yes, many desperate Nazi projects existed mostly on paper, or arrived too late, or promised more than physics could deliver. But the Type 21 was real. It worked. It was operational. And it was frighteningly modern. The only thing it truly lacked was time. History often turns on that word. Time. Had the program matured in 1943 instead of 1945. The Atlantic War might have become bloodier had Germany solved production bottlenecks earlier. Allied convoy doctrine might have faced a dangerous new challenge. Had training pipelines produced experienced crews faster, shipping losses might have risen sharply at critical moments. Not enough to guarantee German victory, but enough to change calculations. Enough to alter timetables. Enough to force decisions. And wars are often shaped by forced decisions. Think of it from the perspective of an American sailor in 1944. He boards a Liberty ship in a port like New York City or Boston. The cargo below deck may contain aircraft parts, ammunition, fuel, rations, medical supplies. He knows German submarines are still out there. He knows men have vanished in freezing Atlantic water. He knows destroyers cannot see everything. Now imagine adding a new fear. Not the old U-boat. A faster one, the quieter one. A submarine built to fight underwater instead of merely hide there. That fear was never fully realized. But for a few months, it was close enough to matter. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of all. History usually remembers what happened. It remembers the flags raised, the capitals captured, the treaties signed. But hidden underneath those certainties are weapons that almost arrived, weapons that almost changed shipping lanes, almost changed casualty lists. Almost changed timetables, almost changed memory itself. The Type 21 was one of those weapons, a machine from the future born in the final nightmare of the past. And in the freezing black Atlantic, just before the end, it came close enough that even the victors took notes. By 1944, the Atlantic War had already changed its shape, but Allied planners did not trust that change because intelligence has a habit of warning you twice. Once when something is emerging, and again when it is almost ready. And the second warning is always more dangerous. The first signs of Germany's next submarine phase were not found at sea. They were found on land, on reconnaissance photographs taken high above the French coast. Allied analysts noticed something unusual near ports controlled by German forces along the Atlantic Wall. Massive reinforced structures too large for normal warehouses, too thick for civilian industry, too deliberate in design to be random construction. These were not ordinary bunkers. They were submarine pens, and they were built to survive the sky. Though, concrete fortresses of the Atlantic along occupied Europe's western coastline, especially in ports such as Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and La Rochelle. Nazi Germany constructed some of the most formidable military structures of World War II. These were not simple shelters. They were industrial-scale fortresses designed specifically for submarines. The purpose was straightforward: protect U-boats. From Allied air superiority. By 1942, German Naval Command had accepted a hard truth: surfacing submarines in open harbors was becoming too dangerous. Allied bombers could strike ports with increasing precision, and submarines under construction or repair were highly vulnerable. So Germany built concrete armor for the ocean war. The submarine pens were enormous vaulted structures made of reinforced steel and concrete so thick that conventional bombs had almost no effect. Some roofs were more than 7 meters thick. Inside, entire submarines could be housed, repaired, refitted, and launched directly into the sea while remaining fully protected from air attack. From above, they looked almost invincible, and in many ways, they were the engineering of invulnerability. Design philosophy behind the pens reflected the desperation and ingenuity of late-war German engineering. Each structure was divided into massive bays. Inside these bays, submarines sat in dry or partially flooded docks. Cranes moved overhead like skeleton arms. Workshops lined the sides, ventilation systems, electrical networks, fuel storage, and torpedo handling rooms were integrated directly into the concrete architecture. The idea was simple: if the submarine could not survive the ocean alone, then the harbor itself would become part of the weapon system. One of the most famous complexes was the massive bunker at Lorient, associated with the headquarters of German submarine operations. Under Karl Dönitz, from the outside, these pens looked like alien monoliths dropped into coastal cities. From the inside, they looked like underground cities dedicated to war beneath water. And for a time, they worked. Allied aircraft dropped bombs on them again and again. Explosions shook coastal towns. Smoke rose over ports, but the pens remained standing. Standard bombs simply bounced off or exploded harmlessly on impact. The submarine war had found shelter beneath concrete. Allied shock. They can survive the bombing in London and Washington. Intelligence officers studied damage reports with growing concern. At first, they assumed bombing accuracy would eventually solve the problem. It did not. Then they assumed heavier bombs would solve the problem. It helped, but not enough. Then they realized something more troubling. These structures were not just hardened buildings. They were strategic shelters designed specifically to neutralize Allied air superiority. If German submarines could be built, repaired, and launched from nearly indestructible pens, then bombing alone would not end the U-boat threat. And if a new generation of submarines like the emerging Type XXI entered service from these protected bases, the Atlantic could face a renewed threat cycle. That was the fear that led to escalation, not panic. Calculation. The bombing war against the pens. The Allied response became one of the most intense strategic bombing efforts of the war. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces began targeting submarine infrastructure with increasing priority. Heavy bombers such as the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the Avro Lancaster were redirected to strike U-boat facilities. But normal bombs were not enough. The pens were too strong. So Allied engineers escalated. They developed massive earthquake bombs, designed not to explode on the surface, but to penetrate deep into the ground or concrete before detonating. Weapons like the British Tallboy and later Grand Slam bombs were introduced specifically for hardened targets. When these bombs hit submarine pens, the effect was different. Instead of shallow explosions, they caused structural shockwaves that could crack concrete from within. Some pens began to show damage. Cracks appeared. Sections of roofs weakened. But the destruction was slow and uneven. And Germany adapted again. The hidden war beneath bombed cities inside occupied France. Life around submarine bases became surreal. Cities like Lorient were heavily bombed, leaving surrounding areas in ruins, but the submarine pens often remained functional. This created a strange contrast. Destroyed neighborhoods surrounding intact concrete monoliths, civilians living among rubble while military operations continued underground. Submarines slipping in and out of protected pens under Allied air raids. It felt like a war inside a war. For Allied intelligence, this raised an uncomfortable realization. Even if Germany lost surface control of Europe, it could still operate an underwater war machine from hardened coastal positions, and if Type 21 submarines were introduced into that system in meaningful numbers, the Atlantic convoy network might face renewed strain at exactly the moment Allied planners expected final victory. American naval planning. Preparing for a second Atlantic War. By late 1944 and early 1945, the United States Navy quietly began preparing for a contingency that most civilians never heard about. They called it, in simplified terms, a renewed submarine campaign scenario. It was not a public fear. It was a professional one. In Washington, naval analysts reviewed shipping vulnerability models. They studied convoy loss rates from earlier in the war. They recalculated what would happen if Germany reintroduced advanced submarines while still holding fortified Atlantic bases. The conclusions were unsettling. Even a weakened Germany, if equipped with next-generation submarines and protected repair infrastructure, could cause disproportionate disruption to Atlantic logistics for a limited but critical period. The T period mattered because that was the period during which Allied forces were preparing for final offensives in Europe and the Pacific. Any disruption could slow everything. So the U.S. Navy began preparing countermeasures. Expanded escort carrier deployment for convoy air cover, improved sonar detection systems, increased long-range patrol aircraft coverage across mid-Atlantic gaps, faster destroyer production cycles. Specialized anti-submarine task groups improved convoy routing intelligence systems. In essence, they were preparing for the possibility that the Atlantic War might not end cleanly, that Germany might, in its final months, still inflict strategic damage, not enough to win, but enough to complicate victory. The intelligence turning point. The real turning point came when Allied intelligence began intercepting clearer informati on about German submarine development programs. Reports confirmed something increasingly difficult to ignore. Germany was attempting to introduce a fundamentally new submarine class into active service, not an incremental upgrade, a doctrinal shift. That was when the Type 21 stopped being speculation and became confirmation. And confirmation changes everything, because intelligence shifts from what might happen to how fast it can arrive. They feared Germany might extend it just long enough to matter. A few more months of disruption, a few more convoy losses, a few more delays in troop movement and supply chains. In war, timing is power. And even a dying adversary can influence timing. The fear that arrived too late. By early 1945, the situation had inverted. Germany was collapsing on land. But under the sea, a paradox remained. A technologically advanced submarine program was emerging at the exact moment the nation building it was falling apart. This created a strange strategic tension in Allied planning. They no longer feared Germany would win the Atlantic War. They feared Germany might extend it just long enough to matter. A few more months of disruption, a few more convoy losses. A few more delays in troop movement and supply chains. In war, timing is power, and even a dying adversary can influence timing. The end game in the Atlantic. When Allied forces finally entered captured submarine facilities in 1945, the scale of what they found confirmed both their fears and their expectations. Inside reinforced pens, engineers discovered partially completed Type 21 submarines. Some were nearly finished, some were damaged. Some were abandoned mid-construction. Blueprints lay scattered across offices. Tools were still in place. It looked like a machine world interrupted mid-function. And outside, The concrete pens still stood scarred, cracked in places, but largely intact. The Atlantic submarine war had not been defeated by a single weapon or a single battle. It had been strangled through logistics, air power, intelligence, and industrial collapse, but it had come close enough to leaving behind something unsettling. Proof that a second phase of the Battle of the Atlantic had been possible. By the time Allied troops physically entered Germany's coastal submarine infrastructure in 1945, the war had already moved beyond the point where these facilities could change its outcome. But they were never just looking for victory anymore. They were looking for understanding, because what they found inside those concrete pens and half-finished submarines was not simply evidence of defeat. It was evidence of a near future that had almost been born inside a collapsing past. The silence inside the pen when American and British forces first stepped into the massive submarine bunkers along the Atlantic coast, places like Brest and Lorient. The silence was almost disorienting. Outside, the war still echoed. Artillery in the east, air raids in the distance, refugees moving through ruined roads. But inside the pens, everything felt frozen. Cranes hung motionless above empty docking bays. Tools lay where workers had dropped them. Half-assembled hull sections sat in dim light, like skeletons of machines that never fully lived. The smell was industrial oil, rust, damp concrete, but beneath it was something more unsettling: abandonment under pressure. This was not a retreat in order. It was interruption. The Allied officers quickly realized something important. Germany had not cleanly ended its submarine program. It had simply lost the ability to continue it. The half-built Futurine 1 bay engineers found nearly completed sections of a Type XXI submarine. The hull shape alone was enough to draw attention. It was unlike earlier U-boats, sleeker, smoother, designed with hydrodynamics as the primary logic rather than surface compromise. One naval engineer reportedly ran his hand along the curved steel and said something that would later be repeated in intelligence summaries. "This is not a submarine built for war. This is a submarine built for the ocean itself." But the vessel was incomplete. Wiring was unfinished. Systems were disconnected. Critical assemblies were missing. And that pattern, repeated across multiple sites, Germany had reached a point where it could design the future faster than it could physically assemble it. Interrogation begins at the same time. Allied intelligence units began systematically interrogating captured German naval personnel. Submarine engineers, shipyard supervisors, electrical specialists, naval officers, workers pulled from underground factories. The goal was not just to gather war crimes evidence or technical diagrams. It was to reconstruct the logic of the program itself. One of the key realizations that emerged from these interrogations was unsettling in its simplicity. The Type XXI was not just a weapon design. It was an industrial philosophy. Germany had tried to solve three problems simultaneously: survival under bombing, mass production under resource collapse, radical technological advancement under wartime pressure. Individually, each challenge was difficult. Together, they created instability. The engineers described a system constantly switching between innovation and improvisation. Blueprints were revised mid-production. Components were redesigned while already being built. Factories were relocated while still operating. Workers were reassigned constantly. Nothing stabilized long enough to reach full efficiency. And yet, despite all of that, the program still produced functioning submarines. That contradiction fascinated Allied analysts. The hidden cost of innovation. Own captured engineer explained it bluntly during interrogation: "We were building the most advanced submarine in the world, in the worst possible conditions." That sentence became a recurring reference in post-war analysis because it captured something deeper than technical detail. It revealed a paradox of total war innovation. Extreme pressure accelerates invention but destroys reliability. The Type XXI program existed at that breaking point. and Allied intelligence began to understand that Germany's most dangerous moment had not been when it was strongest. It had been when it was collapsing, but still capable of engineering ambition. The American engineering shock in the United States. Naval engineers were sent to examine captured vessels and components shipped back for analysis. At facilities in places like New London, technical teams studied hull designs, propulsion systems, and battery configurations. What they found reshaped post-war thinking almost immediately. Several features stood out. Streamlined hull geometry optimized for sustained submerged speed, large-capacity battery systems enabling extended underwater endurance, improved sonar systems for underwater detection, and targeting automated torpedo reloading systems, reducing surface exposure, reduced reliance on surface travel compared to previous submarine classes. Individually, these were improvements. Together, they represented a shift in doctrine. Submarines were no longer surface ships that dive. They were becoming underwater ships that occasionally surface. That philosophical reversal would define naval warfare for the next decades. The Second Atlantic that never happened. As analysts reconstructed what might have occurred if the Type XXI program had matured. Earlier, they outlined a disturbing hypothetical scenario, not a victory scenario, a disruption scenario. If Germany had deployed even a few dozen operational Type XXI submarines in mid-1944, combined with intact Atlantic bases and functioning production lines, the consequences might have included increased convoy losses during critical supply buildup phases, delays in Allied invasion logistics preparation, higher naval escort requirements diverting resources from offensive operations, increased psychological pressure on merchant marine operations, temporary instability in Atlantic shipping confidence. None of this would have changed the final outcome of the war, but it could have changed its tempo. And in global war, tempo is power. That was the part American planners understood most clearly. Operation lessons learned by mid-1945. Allied naval commands had already begun formal lessons learned programs based on captured German technology. The Type XXI was not treated as a curiosity. It was treated as a prototype of future warfare. The U.S. Navy, in particular, began shifting doctrine toward fully submerged operational submarines, greater battery endurance systems, improved underwater sonar targeting, reduced surface exposure tactics, faster submerged transit capabilities. These ideas would eventually feed directly into Cold War submarine development programs. The ocean was no longer being viewed as a surface battlefield with hidden threats beneath it. It was becoming a fully three-dimensional combat space. The end of the U-boat era and the beginning of something else. By the time Germany officially surrendered in May 1945, the Atlantic submarine war was effectively over. But its evolution was not, because weapons do not disappear when wars end. They migrate, they are studied, they are improved, and sometimes they become the foundation of the next strategic era. The Type XXI was one of those weapons, not because it changed World War II, but because it almost changed what came after it. The final irony, perhaps the most haunting realization among Allied naval historians, came years later. The German Type XXI program had failed tactically, but it succeeded conceptually. It proved that submarine warfare would no longer be defined by surface dependence. It proved that underwater endurance was no longer theoretical. It proved that industrial desperation could still produce technological breakthroughs, and it proved something even more unsettling. Even collapsing systems can produce designs that shape the future. Closing reflection of this chapter. In the end, the Allied bombing of submarine pens, the intelligence efforts to decode German production, and the capture of unfinished vessels all contributed to the same conclusion. Germany did not lose the submarine war because it lacked ideas. It lost because it lacked time, stability, and industrial coherence. The weapon that almost changed everything did not fail because it was impossible. It failed because it arrived in a world already collapsing around it. And somewhere beneath the cold Atlantic, inside silent concrete pens now emptied of war, The outlines of that near future remained waiting to be studied, copied, and carried forward into a different century of conflict, asterisk by the time the dust of World War II finally settled. The Atlantic no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a memory that refused to disappear completely. The submarine pens stood silent along the coasts of France and Germany, giant concrete relics of a war that had ended, but whose ideas had not died, and inside Allied naval headquarters, one conclusion had quietly taken hold. The war against submarines had not ended. It had simply changed shape, from German ruins to American blueprints in the months after victory in Europe. CAPTURED German submarine technology was systematically transported, catalogued, and studied. Entire teams of engineers were assigned to analyze what had been recovered from unfinished Type XXI boats, technical documents, and surviving production infrastructure. At naval research centers in the United States, especially around New London, something unusual began to happen. German engineering concepts once built in desperation and collapse were being reinterpreted as the foundation for the next generation of American naval power. The Type 21 was not simply copied. It was translated, refined, rebuilt in a new strategic language, because American naval planners understood something critical. If submarines were now becoming primarily underwater platforms, then the entire doctrine of naval warfare had to change with them. Surface dominance alone was no longer enough. Detection, endurance, and silent movement would define the future. The birth of the Cold War ocean. Within a few years, the geopolitical world transformed again. Former allies became strategic rivals. The United States and the Soviet Union entered an era of global tension, later known as the Cold War. And beneath that ideological confrontation, another race quietly began, the race for underwater supremacy. Soviet engineers studied captured German submarine designs just as intensely as the Americans did. The Type 21 influenced both sides not as a weapon of the past, but as a blueprint for the future. The ocean became a silent chessboard. And submarines became its most important pieces. This shift eventually led to developments that would have been unimaginable during the early years of World War II. Long-endurance diesel-electric submarines based on streamlined hull designs, nuclear-powered submarines capable of remaining submerged for months, advanced sonar systems designed for deep ocean detection, submarine-launched ballistic missile systems carrying strategic nuclear weapons, all of it traced, in part, back to a late-war German experiment that arrived too late to matter in its own time, but early enough to define the next one. The weapon that failed and succeeded at the same time. The Type 21 submarine is often described by historians as a failed weapon system. In a narrow wartime sense, that is true. It did not change the outcome of World War II. It did not restore German naval dominance. It did not stop Allied convoys or alter the final invasion of Europe. But history rarely rewards narrow definitions, because in a broader sense, the Type 21 succeeded in something far more enduring. It changed what submarines would become. It demonstrated that underwater warfare was no longer a secondary dimension of naval combat. It was becoming the primary one. And once that ideal was accepted, everything that followed became inevitable. The final journey of the Atlantic War. Looking back, Allied commanders later reflected on a strange truth. The most dangerous moment of the submarine war did not come at its beginning, when German U-boats first sank Allied shipping in the early years. It came near its end, when Germany, stripped of resources, territory, and strategic depth, still managed to produce a weapon that belonged to the future. A weapon that arrived too late to win, but not too late to be remembered. That is why intelligence officers continued to study it long after the war. Not because they feared Germany, but because they feared what it revealed. That technological leaps do not always come from stability. Sometimes they come from collapse. The forgotten fortresses, the concrete submarine pens, were never fully erased. Even today, in places like Lorient and Brest, massive reinforced structures still stand as silent monuments to that industrial ambition. Tourists walk through them without fully realizing what they represent. They are not just ruins of World War II. They are physical proof of a moment when war, engineering, desperation, and imagination collided beneath layers of steel and concrete. Inside those walls, the Atlantic War was once planned, protected, and nearly extended into a new phase. A phase that never arrived. The last image of the near future, if there is a single image that captures the meaning of the Type 21 story, it is not a battle. It is not a victory. It is not even a sinking ship. It is a submarine that almost existed in time. A vessel designed for a world that was arriving too quickly for its builders to survive. A machine born from urgency, shaped by destruction, and completed only in fragments of its original vision. And yet still powerful enough to force its enemies to rethink the ocean itself. Final reflection: history remembers winners. But it should also remember near things, near victories, near defeats, near revolutions. The Type 21 submarine belongs to that category. It was not the weapon that changed World War II, but it was the weapon that almost changed what came after it. And in that narrow space between failure and influence, it left its most lasting impact. Not in the war it fought, but in the wars that followed. Because long after the Atlantic convoys stopped fearing U-boats, navies around the world began building something new. Silent vessels, deep vessels, enduring vessels, machines that would carry the logic of the Type 21 into the nuclear age and beyond. And somewhere beneath the ocean, where sound travels farther than sight and darkness lasts longer than memory, the idea of that German submarine still echoes not as a victor, not as a failure, but as a turning point that arrived just a little too late to be seen for what it truly was. The weapon that almost changed everything became the blueprint for everything that came after.